Hi, I'm Patrick Sullivan. This is a very tired and grumpy Evelina, and this is Recurring Insight. Abrupt Decay has been a pretty popular request in the comments for a long time, and I really enjoyed talking about this one too because I think it's a really great example of a removal spell done right, and it's not weak, and that's a hard one to get right. The combination of incentives, gameplay, sad babies, all really great, so hope you enjoy.
I've often remarked that Magic, and certainly competitive Magic, is balanced around destructive interaction. That there are a lot of very cheap and powerful cards that prevent your opponent from taking game actions or undo game actions they've already taken, for better or for worse. And there's dimensions of this that I've been critical of in the past in articles I've written or commentary that I've done. But that does sort of invite the question, what does good destructive interaction look like? Certainly, we don't want a game where we're just two ships passing in the night. Some amount of interaction, even if it can be a little obnoxious or break up synergies, is valuable. And then how are you supposed to do that in a way that's fun and dynamic? And I think Abrupt Decay is about as good as it gets. There's really wide coverage. Destroys any non-land permanent with a converted mana cost 3 or less. That covers a lot of stuff, but there's some very obvious blind spots to it. Cards that cost 4 or more. There's two really good things about this dynamic. One, the card naturally scales up as formats become more powerful. As formats become more and more powerful, they typically become faster and faster and revolve around cheaper and cheaper cards. So Abrupt Decay very organically scales up with the power level of the format. And the second good thing is it encourages more expensive cards. There's also the fact that it has wide coverage, but the incentives on the other side of the table are not as perverse as with some other cards. Take, for example, Dromoka's Command. That's another card that's ostensibly a narrow removal spell. In many ways, appears to be very similar to Abrupt Decay. But there are some really important differences there. Dromoka's Command is exceptional at two things. One is engaging in creature combat just as a trick. And second is blowing up enchantments. It's really great at both of those rules. Which means, if Dromoka's Command is prevalent, the answer to it is cut your creatures and don't play with any enchantments whatsoever, two not ideal sets of incentives. With Abrupt Decay, the incentive is much harder to pull off. It's essentially cut all permanents from your deck that cost 3 or less. That's much harder to do. And then lastly, and critically, there's an illusion of power going on here, but when it comes up, it's extremely valuable. This spell cannot be countered, reads really, really well. People don't like having their spells countered, and also, pretty much the only response, or one of very few responses to spells, is to counter them. So Abrupt Decay says you can't even do that. But it's not very common that people want to protect cheap permanents with counter spells. So even though that text box is really appealing, it doesn't come up all that frequently, and it doesn't really add that much power to the card. But the times where it does come up, thank goodness that it is there. Someone who is willing to protect cheap permanents with counter spells is almost certainly up to no good. The most generous that you can sort of describe them as is a deck like Merfolk or Delver, but a lot of combo decks occupy a space of trying to protect some cheap permanents with some counter spells. And so even though Abrupt Decay's can't be counter text box doesn't really come up that frequently, it adds a lot of appeal, and the times where it does come up, it makes the card play so much better. It's such a great thing for formats to have that sort of safety valve, that sort of release. So Abrupt Decay gets top billing in terms of destructive interaction that reads well, plays really well, and engenders good incentives on the other side of the table. There aren't that many examples of removal spells with those characteristics that have showed up in tournament level play, but Abrupt Decay is a shining example of, with some wise development and some judicious use of strengths and weaknesses, how a removal spell, even one that's popular, even one that shows up frequently, can be positive rather than negative for the Magic ecosystem.
So that was Abrupt Decay, and this is a Recurring Insight. A couple things you can do from here. Make sure that you are subscribed to the StartC Games YouTube page so you can get notified when new stuff goes up there. Throw a like and a comment up there as well. I did this video in part because someone was very diligent in requesting their card over and over again, so it takes time, but I will get to it. And all this stuff is free for you to do, and now you have confirmation that I have children, literal mouths to feed. So take a second, do this, costs you nothing, and keep pumping those algorithms. Alley.